Hi there. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Stacy James with Just Spooling Around, and we're going to be learning the basic techniques for decreasing the stitch count on any given row, which is one way to add shape to our projects. So let's get started.
Okay, we're going to be going over some shaping techniques using decreases that have matching pairs. What that means is that the decrease on the right side has a matching decrease on the left side, so that we have left-leaning decreases right of center and right-leaning decreases left of center. Now, the technical knitting terms have been created for knitting with needles, but what I've learned is that most people who've picked up hand knitting have never actually knitted with a set of needles, so a lot of the terminology doesn't make sense because we don't use our hands to knit the way we use needles to knit. So, I've created new terminology specific to hand knitting to make learning easier. What I have here is a swatch of the 4 different pairs of decreases we'll be covering. I've started with what's technically known as SSK, or slip slip knit, a left-leaning decrease, and knit 2 together, its right-leaning counterpart. There are actually 3 different ways to work these 2 decreases, so naturally there's more technical terms associated with it. The SKP, or slip knit pass, which is left-leaning, and KRPR, or knit return pass return, its right-leaning counterpart. Now, this is purely informational, so no need to remember all that. I've consolidated all 4 terms into just 2. Decrease to the left-leaning decrease, and decrease to the right. Yep, you guessed it, its right-leaning counterpart. And I'll be demonstrating 2 of the 3 different ways to work these decreases. This second set of decreases shows the second way to perform the decrease left and decrease right, which looks exactly the same as the first. Hence, the reduction to just 1 name and 1 demonstration segment to cover both ways. The third set of decreases involves twisting stitches before performing the decrease, which can be very pretty when incorporated decoratively in a design. The decrease also lays a bit flatter as a result of the twist, but I have yet to come across a seamless decreasing technique. Now, technically, they are called knit 2 together through the back loop, the left-leaning decrease, and CRSD, or crossed right slanting decrease, its counterpart. As you can see, neither term even hints to twisting stitches or makes it obvious that they're matching decreases. So I've coined the terms T2L decrease left and T2 right decrease right, which stands for twist to left, decrease left, and twist to right, decrease right, to address that whole issue. Finally, the last decrease doesn't actually technically have a partner, but it can be worked in a left and right twisted manner. This decrease is technically called CDD, or central double decrease, which accounts only for the left twisted central decrease. However, you can work this as a right twisted center decrease as well, which I've coined as decrease 3 left and decrease 3 right. In the swatch, you can see I have only the left twisted version. Decreases are far easier to work than increases, but again, there's no way to make them invisible. Each pair will present a distinct separation. In segment 2, we'll be learning 2 different ways to work the decrease left and decrease right. Now begin with a small swatch of 12 stitches and 2 rows to work up our first pair of decreases, decrease left and decrease right. If you've worked my heart pattern, you'll be familiar with these decreases, so you're ahead of the ball. Left-leaning decreases are worked right of center, whereas right-leaning decreases are worked left of center. Typically, the technical knitting terms are SSK, or slip slip knit, along with its right-leaning counterpart, knit 2 together, and SKP, or slip knit pass, and its right-leaning counterpart, KRPR, or knit return pass return. These terms make 0 sense to most hand knitters because lexicon was created specifically for knitting with needles, and most hand knitters have never knitted with needles, so I've coined these decreases as decrease to the left with a left arrow and decrease right with the right arrow to make them specific to hand knitting. Now we'll have 2 stitches along each edge, so our decreases will be worked using the 3rd and 4th stitches from each edge. So let's start by knitting the first 2 stitches. Normally, we knit the edge stitches just a bit smaller than the rest. That won't be the case when working a series of decreases to shape a piece. The edge stitches need to be at least the same size as the rest, possibly a bit bigger because of the slant. Okay, there's the 2nd stitch. Now we'll work our decrease left, which again is typically worked right of center. The decrease involves 2 stitches. This is stitch 1 and this is stitch 2. The first technique is to cross the first stitch over the 2nd stitch and then knit them together, making sure to draw those 2 right to where the working yarn exits the last stitch worked to eliminate that slack or space between the stitches. The second technique works very well when your stitches have to be small and tight, say for plushies or pillows when using polyfill to stuff them. We don't want that poly coming through our stitches. When stitches are that small, it becomes difficult and time-consuming to work a stitch through 2 stitches at once. So this second technique involves working each stitch in the decrease separately. So instead of crossing the first stitch over the second, we're going to skip stitch 1 and knit stitch 2 right behind that skip stitch, making sure to draw it in right where the working yarn exits the last worked stitch. Then drop the working yarn and pass the skipped stitch over the knit stitch just worked. It's the same exact decrease, just 2 different ways to work it, okay? Now we'll knit the next 4 stitches, which brings us to that 4th stitch from the edge. This leaves us with our 2 stitches for the decrease and our 2 stitches for the edge. This time, our decrease will lean to the right. Using the first technique to decrease right, instead of crossing the first stitch over the second, we'll be crossing the second stitch over the first before knitting them together. Again, be sure to draw the crossed stitches into that last worked stitch right where the working yarn exits to eliminate that slack between the stitches. To work the second decrease right technique, we're going to first knit that first stitch, then drop our working yarn and pass the second stitch over the stitch we just worked, giving it that right leaning slant. Now let's knit our last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 10 stitches rather than 12. Now let's do it again. We'll knit those first 2 stitches, bringing us to the 3rd stitch from the edge. We'll use both the 3rd and 4th stitches to perform the decrease left. Now we can either cross that first stitch over the second and knit them together, or we can work them separately by skipping the first stitch and knitting the second right behind it. Then drop the working yarn and pass the skipped stitch over the one just worked. Knit the next 2 stitches, bringing us to the 4th stitch from the edge. We'll use both the 4th and 3rd stitches in our decrease right. Using the first technique, we'll cross the 2nd stitch over the first and knit them together. Using the second technique, knit that first stitch, drop the working yarn, and pass the 2nd stitch over the last worked stitch. Now knit the last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 8 stitches this time. And let's take a look at what we have. We can see that the decreases lay on top of the vertical column being consolidated on either side of center, creating a thicker, much more defined diagonal column. Let's do this one last time. Knit those first 2 stitches, bringing us to the 3rd stitch from the edge. Now we can either cross that first stitch over the second and knit them together, or we can skip that first stitch and knit the second right behind it. Then drop the working yarn and pass the skipped stitch over the one just worked. There we have our decrease left. Now, to work the decrease right, either cross the 2nd stitch over the first and knit them together, or knit that first stitch, drop the working yarn, and pass the second stitch over the last stitch worked. Then knit the last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 6 stitches. Now let's see what we have. The decrease left and decrease right creates a lovely even inward slant on either side of center. The diagonal column is much thicker, thus more defined than the rest, but it's very pretty and quite clean looking. These decreases can be used in limitless ways. It all just depends on your personal vision, so play around with them a bit. Doing so may inspire a new design. In segment 3, we'll be learning how to work the twisted versions of decrease left and decrease right using the T2L decrease left or twist to left, decrease left, and T2R decrease right or twist to right, decrease right techniques. I'll begin with a small swatch of 12 stitches and 2 rows to work up our second pair of decreases. T2L decrease left or twist to left, decrease left, and T2R decrease right or twist to right, decrease right. Now, you already know how to work the decrease right and decrease left, so this will be easy peasy. Before we get started, these decreases are worked in 2 parts. The first part is worked on an odd row, which involves twisting stitches, and the second part is worked on the even row, or return pass, and also involves twisting stitches. So there's a few extra steps in this technique compared to the last. Again, left-leaning decreases are worked right of center, whereas right-leaning decreases are worked left of center, typically. The technical knitting terms are knit 2 together through the back loop, along with its right-leaning counterpart, CRSD, or crossed right slanting decrease. But again, these terms are specific to knitting with needles, and that's just not what we're doing here. Now, we'll have 2 stitches along each edge, so our decreases will be worked using the 3rd and 4th stitches from each edge. So let's start by knitting those first 2 stitches, making sure the edge stitch is just as big as or a tad bigger than the rest to accommodate the slack. So here we have our 2 stitches for our decrease. The first part of the abbreviation is telling us to twist to left. Now, if you've ever worked the twisted stitch or herringbone patterns, you're quite familiar with this already, so let's twist each stitch to the left. This shrinks our stitches quite a bit, so it may be easiest to perform the decrease left separately rather than crossing our stitches and knitting them together. But we can either cross that first twisted stitch over the second and knit them together, or skip that first stitch, draw the second stitch behind the skipped twisted stitch and knit it, then drop the working yarn and pass the skip stitch over the stitch just worked. And there's our left leaning decrease. Now we'll knit the next 4 stitches, bringing us to the 4th stitch from the edge. The abbreviation on this decrease is telling us to twist the next 2 stitches to the right, so let's do that now. Then we need to decrease right, so we either cross the second stitch over the first and knit them together, or we knit the first twisted stitch, drop the working yarn, and pass the second twisted stitch over the last stitch worked. And that's the T2R decrease right decrease. Knit the last 2 stitches. Now on the return pass, we're still going to knit all the stitches across. However, we need to twist our decreased stitches. So we'll knit these 2 first stitches, bringing us to our 3rd stitch from the left, which is the decreased stitch. Now we'll just twist this stitch to the right to keep it uniform with what we did in the row below, and then knit through it. Then we'll knit the next 4 stitches, bringing us to our 3rd stitch from the edge, which is also our decreased stitch. This time, twisting that stitch to the left before knitting through it. And now knit the last 2 stitches, and we'll do it all over again. Knit those first 2 stitches, then twist the next 2 stitches to the left. Then either cross the first twisted stitch over the second and knit them together, or skip that first twisted stitch, draw the second one directly behind it to knit it, Drop the working yarn and pass the skipped twisted stitch over the last stitch worked to complete the decrease. Now, knit the next 2 stitches, bringing us to the 4th stitch from the edge. Then, twist the next 2 stitches to the right this time. Either cross the 2nd twisted stitch over the 1st and knit them together, or knit through the 1st twisted stitch, drop the working yarn and pass the 2nd twisted stitch over the last worked stitch. Then, knit the last 2 stitches. Now, knit the first 2 stitches on the return pass, bringing us to our decreased stitch from the previous row. Twist that stitch to the right and knit it. Knit the next 2 stitches, bringing us to the 3rd stitch from the edge, and twist it to the left this time before knitting it. Then, knit those last 2 stitches. Now we'll do this one last time before taking a look at what we've done. So knit those first 2 stitches. Twist the next 2 stitches to the left, and then either cross the first twisted stitch over the 2nd and knit them together, or skip that first twisted stitch, draw the 2nd one directly behind it to knit it, drop the working yarn, and then pass that skipped twisted stitch over the last stitch worked to complete the decrease. We don't have any stitches between our decreases any longer, so we now twist the next 2 stitches, but to the right this time. Then, either cross the 2nd stitch over the 1st and knit them together, or knit through the 1st twisted stitch, drop the working yarn, and pass the 2nd twisted stitch over the last worked stitch. Then, knit the last 2 stitches. Now, knit the first 2 stitches on the return pass, bringing us to our decreased stitch. Twist that stitch to the right and knit it. Then, twist that next stitch to the left before knitting it, and then knit those last 2 stitches. Now let's take inventory by comparing it to the regular decrease. Both sets of decreases are defined or raised above the regular stitches, aren't they? This technique gives us that nice stockinette column that goes with the stitch pattern. It also lays directly on top of the combined stitches, adding a layer of thickness on that diagonal column. Now these decreases with the twisted stitches also lay on top of the stitches, but because we're twisting them before performing the decrease, they're at more of a slant between the columns than directly on top, so it lays a bit flatter in terms of depth. They also add a beautiful braided decorative texture to the piece as well. So again, play around with this set of decreases to spark a new vision. In segment 4, we'll be learning how to decrease in a straight line using the decreased 3 to the left technique. I'll begin with a small swatch of 9 stitches and 2 rows this time to work up our non-slanting decrease, the decrease 3 to the left. When would you use this type of decrease, you ask? Well, I used it to separate the right and left sides of my baby heart pattern. So if you've worked that, you already know how to work this decrease. Since this is a non-slanting decrease, we'll work it right down the middle of our swatch using 3 stitches as part of the decrease. Normally, the decrease either slants left or right, yeah? Well, not this one. This decrease will result in a beautiful twisted vertical line. Now, the technical knitting term is CDD, or central double decrease, but since it works exactly the same way as the decrease left, it seemed more logical to keep the terms similar by just adding 3 to the abbreviation since it involves 3 rather than just 2 stitches. Since we'll be working with the 3 stitches in the middle of our stitch count, the number of stitches to knit along the edge will change. On the first row of the decrease, we'll have 3 edge stitches, then 2, and finally just the 1. Now, let's start by knitting the first 3 stitches. Normally, we knit the edge stitches just a bit smaller than the rest, and that won't be the case when working a series of decreases to shape a piece. The edge stitches need to be at least the same size as the rest, possibly a bit bigger because of the slant. Okay, we're at our 3 center stitches, so let's work that decrease 3 to the left. Just as with the decrease to the left, there are 2 different ways to work this decrease. I'll demonstrate working them individually first. We'll skip the next 2 stitches, draw the 3rd stitch directly behind the 1st, and knit it. Drop the working yarn, then pass the 2nd skip stitch over the last stitch worked. Pass the 1st skip stitch over that last stitch worked to complete the decrease. Now we have just the 1 stitch from 3. We can see how this is automatically tucking under to the right, and this left is leaning into the decrease, so we want to draw that in close to tuck it under the decrease as well as we knit our last 3 stitches. Now knit all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 7 stitches. Okay, so now we have 2 stitches surrounding our 3 in the middle, so let's knit those 2 first. This time we'll cross that first stitch over the second stitch, then cross them both over the third and knit all 3 stitches together, making sure we keep that slack nice and tight. So that's the other way to work this decrease. Now draw those last 2 stitches into the decrease and knit them along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 5 stitches. Now we have 1 stitch surrounding our 3 in the middle. So let's knit 1. We're either going to cross the first stitch over the second, then cross both of those stitches over the third and knit them all together, or we'll skip the next 2 stitches. Draw the third stitch directly behind the first and knit it. Drop the working yarn and pass the second skipped stitch over the last stitch worked. Then pass the first skipped stitch over the last stitch worked to complete the decrease. Now, knit the last stitch along with the 3 stitches on the return pass. We could decrease one last time to bring our swatch to a point, but I think we get a good look at how pretty the twist is on this vertical decrease. Also, now that you understand the concept, you can also play around with working the decrease 3 to the right. You have all the tools you need at this point to switch that to a right twist. Have fun playing around with these newly learned decreases.
I hope you found this comparative demonstration helpful. Play around with the different techniques to get a feel for them. I think you'll find that adding these techniques to your tool belt helps to hone your skills and increase the quality of your work to achieve your personal vision. If you have any questions or need help with anything, please do not hesitate to comment below or email me at support@justspoolinaround.com. Thanks again for watching. Peace out, all you hand knitting lovies. Until next time.